At 2 a.m. on January 3, 2026, American helicopters landed near the presidential compound in Caracas. By 2:35, Nicolas Maduro was in custody. By dawn, military convoys were seen surrounding the country's state-run oil terminals. The number flashed across global monitors. $17.3 trillion, the estimated value of Venezuela's proven oil reserves, now under new control. Most headlines framed it as justice, but it was something else entirely. Not a beginning. Not a bold move. It was the moment. An empire stopped hiding its decline, and the rest of the world quietly adjusted. No nation believes it is an empire in decline. Not Rome, not the Netherlands, not Britain. Certainly not the United States, because decline rarely looks like an event. It looks like everything's still working, just slightly worse. Delayed flights, record debts, grocery bills stretching checks that used to be comfortable. Government promises that cost more to fund than they deliver. It is slow. Almost manageable. Until it is not. For the past 2,000 years, a recurring economic cycle has shaped the rise and fall of dominant powers. The Roman denarius, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, all faded following a disturbingly similar path. Sound money, wealth, expansion, debt, debasement, desperation. Collapse. Every time, only the faces, borders, and technologies change. At first, the currency is strong, backed by real value. Gold, silver, trust. Trade flows through it. Growth comes from productivity, not manipulation. Societies innovate. Cities rise. Systems expand. Then comes scale military, social, institutional land. The bill begins to grow, maintaining the image of strength becomes more important than fixing the sources of weakness. Spending outpaces revenue. To sustain the illusion, nations borrow, then print. Slowly, value erodes. Eventually, leaders reach for something tangible: resources, land, hard assets, some way to compensate, to buy trust. That is when the headlines shift from policy to action, from diplomacy to seizure, from cooperation to survival. And each time, people say those 5 familiar words. This time will be different, but math is not ideological. It does not bend to optimism or belief. It responds to pressure. And when an empire spends more than it produces, borrows more than it earns, and expands further than it can control, math sets the timer. The script is not secret, but it is rarely noticed until Act 4, and by then, the audience is in it, not watching, living. The headlines focused, as they always do, on the surface: Nicolas Maduro arrested, democracy restored, justice delivered. Commentators debated whether it was legal, ethical, strategic. Analysts discussed regime change, failed socialism, narco-alliances. But that was not the real story. Venezuela was never about Maduro. It was about barrels. Over 300 billion of them, at roughly $57 per barrel. Venezuela's underground wealth sits above $17 trillion in value, locked beneath a nation long disconnected from global trade. And now, under new control, the raid was not a surprise. It was a signal. The financial empire that once exported paper and influence had turned its force inward to pull hard assets out. This was not about ideology. It was about inputs, because behind closed doors, decision-makers are staring at numbers that do not work. A debt spiral gaining velocity, 38 trillion and counting. Interest payments crossing $1 trillion annually. Fragile bonds sold on trust that wavers each quarter. Inflation persistent. Confidence slipping, and when financial systems strain, leaders reach for what they can touch: oil, metals, land, ports, just as Rome expanded east in search of gold. Just as the Dutch fought to retain trade routes. Just as Britain intervened to keep colonies producing, Venezuela is not an outlier. It is textbook, light-stage empire behavior, a foreign operation justified by headlines. Executed with precision, designed to delay decline with something real, not because the oil fields will fix the debt. They will not. Not because seizing assets restores value. It can't, but because when a currency loses intrinsic trust, possession becomes the new policy. And 17 trillion in proven reserves is the kind of possession that buys just a little more time. A currency does not collapse when paper runs out. It collapses when belief fades. Throughout history, every dominant currency starts with something solid: gold, silver, grain, land. But as empires grow, stability becomes more about perception than reality. The money works because everyone agrees it does. Until they stop, the strength of the US dollar does not come from the ink or the treasury. It comes from its role as the trusted foundation of global trade. Over 80% of international transactions settle in dollars. Countries borrow in it, save in it, price oil and food in it. But trust has a half-life. And the signs of erosion began long before Venezuela from 2000 to 2023. The dollar's share of global reserves fell from 71% to under 59%. Quietly but steadily, nations began diversifying, adding more euros, more yuan, more gold. Not because they hated the dollar, but because they feared dependence on it when Russia was cut off from SWIFT. And its dollar reserves were frozen by the West. The message was unmistakable. Control over money can be revoked not by market forces, but by political ones. Now consider a developing nation holding billions in U.S. reserves. Watching a G20 country lose access overnight, that nation quietly starts asking a dangerous question. What happens if they cut us off too? That fear, once whispered, now shapes policy. Trade agreements bypass the dollar. Gold purchases increase. Central banks explore digital ledger systems outside U.S. surveillance. None of this creates panic, but it changes posture. The dollar still dominates, but it no longer feels untouchable, and when money stops being trusted to store value without permission, its true strength begins to erode not through collapse, but through quiet exit. Collapse is never announced. It begins with a relocation, a fund transfer, a changed passport application, a shipping order redirected to Singapore instead of San Francisco. In 2025, over 142,000 millionaires left their home countries. The projection for 2026, over 165,000, not refugees, not criminals. Investors, business owners, high-income professionals, they are not making statements. They are making exits. The headlines explain it: await tax planning, political stability, real estate incentives. But underneath is something simpler: instinct. A quiet recognition that something once trusted is now unstable, and wealth always moves faster than news. It is not just people, it is systems. The UAE, Singapore, Switzerland. These jurisdictions are no longer merely stable, they are strategic. Lower taxes, strong banking privacy, asset protection laws, all tailored for a world where capital wants to remain mobile. They are not waiting for collapse, they are planning around it. Meanwhile, the shift in holdings tells a quiet story. Central banks increasing their gold reserves, trade settlements shifting to local currencies, cross-border deals being made in anything but dollars. Even Western companies are hedging, not publicly, but with real capital placements off the dollar, and it all happens before things break. By the time the public feels the consequences through taxes, inflation, or restrictions, the majority of mobile capital has already positioned itself elsewhere. This is not betrayal, it is self-preservation. In every empire before now, the most prepared did not wait for announcements. They read movement, data, tone, law. They understood that wealth is not just money, it is freedom of choice, and once that begins to shrink, those who can act do. Silently, ahead of the crowd. For decades, the strength of the United States appeared unshakable. The currency backed global trade. The economy set trends. The military secured sea lanes and allies. Confidence in its financial system allowed Washington to borrow without consequence, spending more than it earns year after year, but beneath the surface, the numbers stopped making sense. The national debt crossed $38 trillion. Interest payments alone surpassed $1 trillion annually. That is more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than all federal education spending combined. This is not simply a budget issue. It is something far more dangerous. Fiscal Dominance. A situation where the government's debt becomes so large, it controls central bank policy, raise interest rates to fight inflation. Debt payments explode, keep rates low to manage debt. Inflation erodes the dollar. Either way, the system starts to cannibalize itself. Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen called it out directly. On January 5, 2026, she warned that the preconditions for fiscal dominance are clearly strengthening. In official terms, that is a red flag. In plain English, it means the government is running out of room to maneuver. This is the moment in every empire story where momentum becomes weight, where efficiency becomes complexity, where delay replaces repair. Rome raised taxes and clipped coins. The Dutch borrowed heavily and lost control of their trade. Britain clung to illusions of reserve currency status even as their economy hollowed out. None of them collapsed overnight. They decayed, and every temporary patch of war, a new tax policy, a resource seizure just bought time. That is what Venezuela represents. Time. Bought with barrels. Measured in quarters, but time, once purchased this way, stops being a solution. It becomes the final asset the empire is trying to protect. Empires rarely walk away. They do not announce their decline. They outsource it, delay it, deny it. They try one more reform, one more war, one more stimulus, until what worked before no longer does. And in those final stages, history shows us a haunting rhythm, not of collapse, but of forced recalibration. Rome taxed until farmers abandoned their land. The Dutch borrowed until creditors became rulers. Britain printed, devalued, and handed the mantle to a rising dollar it once dismissed. None foresaw their final day. They wrote laws until the laws could not be enforced. They held currency until no one else would, and now the United States is entering that same narrowing corridor slowly, step by step. Wealth is migrating. Confidence is leaking. Hard assets are being reacquired through soft power and, recently, through steel and rotor blades. But empires do not truly end with political statements or hostile takeovers. They end when their financial system can no longer convince the world it functions without force. What comes next is not a single crash, but a series of uncomfortable shifts, spending cuts no one wants to make, entitlement promises that cannot be kept, inflation that becomes structural, policies that feel reactive, public confidence fading quietly, then loudly, and eventually the conversation begins. First in closed-door meetings, then in editorials, then in market behavior itself. Do we need a new anchor? Does the world trust the dollar the way it used to? The answers will not come immediately, but the fact those questions are even being asked tells us everything. This is not about predicting collapse. It is about understanding weight and watching who is still swimming when the tide finally goes out. Wealth does not disappear. It moves, sometimes slowly, through market trends and policy changes, sometimes instantly in the space between sanctions and settlement. Default and devaluation, printing and permission, wars are loud. Political collapse makes the headlines. But financial transitions happen in silence. A file transferred, an asset moved. A decision made at 2 a.m., just like it was on January 3rd. The United States remains a giant militarily, culturally, economically. But even giants can be forced to shift under their own weight. And that weight is now measured in trillions, in trust, in time that no longer stretches the way it once did. Empires never believe the rules apply to them until history shows them that they do. This moment is not about Venezuela. It is not about oil. It is about a global system that bought decades of leverage on borrowed belief. Venezuela's collapse did not break the financial balance. It revealed that the balance had already shifted. What changed on that January morning was not control of a country, but proof that the rules had changed while most of the world was still following old ones. And now, as trust slowly erodes, and wealth quietly escapes, one question remains: when the system resets again, as it always does, how will you know which side of it you are standing on?